Chapter 26 is what we're going over today, federal budgets and public policy. Pretty easy chapter. Not a lot of graphs, not a lot of really complicated information, just sort of starting you down the road to understanding how the federal government puts together budgets. And public policy is just policy on how the government decides how to spend money on public goods. Public goods are the goods available to all of us, or at least some of us. I think I got my PowerPoint worked out. Please let me know if it's not changing slides for you on your screen. Will somebody let me know if they see a new slide?
I see it.
You see it? Great. Thank you so much. Okay. So the federal budgeting process, it's like any budget. It's got revenues, it's got the money coming in, and it's got the expenses or the outlays and the money going out. There's a process. There is a budget every year. So every year, the federal government, the president, the powers that be, all of those that essentially, members of the Senate, members of the House who are really responsible for state-by-state budgeting, all are a part of this process. So the government, the president is the first to propose a general budget. So obviously he has people on his team that puts the budget together. He then has a council of economic advisors that send what they call their economic report of the president, which is part of the budgeting process, and give some recommendations for what these economic advisors feel like the economy is going to look like, and if they feel like there is anything in that budget that they think needs to be adjusted. Step 2 is going to be that budget has to get approved. It's a gigantic budget, and it actually takes a really, really, really long time to get approved. As you're going to see here in a minute, it actually, a lot of times, takes more than a year to get the annual budget approved, which is a ridiculous system. And then at some point, there's a budget resolution. So there's a lot of back and forth in the House, in the Senate. Obviously, every member of the House, every senator is going to want that budget to represent their state and the interests of their state. And so it's a pretty cumbersome process. The defense's share of federal outlays has declined since 1960. Okay, so that's not actually the most important part of this graph, although your author is having you take note of that. I think because your author, and I think he mentions this in the book, that a lot of people think that here in the US we spend a lot of money on defense, and we do, but as a fraction of the total budget, it's actually not as much as you might think. If you look at this chart right here, you'll actually see that the combination of Social Security, Medicare, and welfare, which are all transfer payments, government transfer payments, those are going to make up really a majority of the money that gets spent in this country. The yellow piece, which is your net interest, that's interest on the national debt. The national debt's in the $21 trillion range. I haven't looked at it lately, but I'm sure it hasn't changed that much. And we're proposing putting another couple $1 trillion in economic relief on top of that. So increasing the national debt by almost 10%. This is just interest on the national debt. Other outlays is going to be that pink area there. That's really what's up for debate. It's really only that pink portion. I mean, that's the stuff that's subject to change. Defense is subject to change too, and it depends on whether we have a war or threats of a war or things like that, what that's going to look like. But you can see that has gone down significantly in terms of being a percent of the total budget. There have actually been some estimates that here in another 20 to 30 years, we won't have any money to pay for anything other than transfer payments and interest on the national debt. I don't know if that's true, that'll remain to be seen, but This chat is hilarious. Okay, so what are the problems with the budgeting process? Okay, I've alluded to a few of those problems. The first one is the timetable. So a lot of times we get to the beginning of a new calendar year and we actually don't have a budget for that year that's been approved. It's a very lengthy, very cumbersome, very political process that actually begins far before that year actually arrives. In many cases, a year or two for 2020 is when they will start the 2020 budgeting process. And sometimes by January 1st, 2020, for example, there won't be a budget approved. In those sorts of cases, we practice something called continuing resolutions. This is an important definition for your exam, is to understand what continuing resolutions are. It's basically, if we don't have an approved budget for the current year, we use last year's budget. Because the fact is, a lot of our expenses stay the same. And it's a pretty good framework for what the next year is going to look like. And so I would say, for the most part, it's a good tool, it's a good practice, is that continuing resolution. Another problem with the budget is that really 75% of the budget isn't up for debate. It's money that's been allocated due to existing legislation or existing laws, and money's been allocated. That's going to be things like Social Security. That's going to be things, like I said, that are actual legislation that says we spend X number of dollars on such and such a project in such and such a way. So, so it's really only a quarter of the budget that's up for debate, and it still takes a year and a half. Pretty ridiculous, but it is the current system that we use. Another problem with the budget, and to me this is kind of a big one, is that there's no separate capital budget. So when we think about capital, we think about the things that we use to produce other goods and services. So capital is really important when you're talking about providing goods and services to an entire country. A lot of times in big companies, budgets are divided into subcategories. We have our capital expenditures, we have our operating expenditures, because operating is just that, like that day-to-day stuff, like buying paper towels and writing, income checks to people every 2 weeks or whatever. Capital is big. It's thinking about investing in the future. It's usually high dollar expenditures. And so we would probably be better served as a country doing it like most businesses do and creating subcategories of that budget and assigning those to, the appropriate parties to look over and make decisions about. But instead, we lump it all together. So we have really stupid stuff combined with really important stuff. And we have the president and the Senate and the economists trying to sort through really a mess. The other thing is it's pretty overly detailed. Again, this is because of politics, okay? So there are literally thousands of line items on this budget. I think we would be, better served creating big pools of money, big pots of money. And I think your author suggests this too. It's just an efficiency thing. Big pools of money that then can be assigned to different task forces within the Senate to then decide how those monies get allocated in a more detailed way. Your author suggests some possible budget reforms. We've talked about budget reforms in this country a lot because it's an inefficient process. I don't think it's something that usually makes the news or things like that, but I know for economists, especially when we talk about macro, it is something that we do talk about because it just creates so much inefficiency and wastes so much time, our current process. So first of all, maybe proposing a biennial budget, which basically sets the budget for 2 years at a time instead of trying to do a budget every year. You think that might cut down on some of the time and the energy that the president and the economists and the Senate are spending on budgets, when I think as US citizens, we would prefer that maybe they spend time doing more valuable things. Simplify the budget. I talked about this, creating pools of money and assigning those to people within Senate task forces and things like that. And then, of course, dividing that budget into some subcategories that make more sense. I think operating budget stuff is a little easier to decide on, so it could get, ticked off the list pretty quickly, where capital budget stuff is going to take much longer periods of time to discuss and tweak that part of the budget. Any questions so far? It's pretty simple, straightforward stuff. All right. So fiscal impact of the federal budget. So here we're talking a little bit more about debt and the budget deficits that we run a lot of years. Now, a deficit and the national debt are different. A deficit is something that we would have sort of on a year-to-year basis. That's running the budget, looking at the budget, how much money is going out, how much money is going in. No surprise to you, the US government spends more than it brings in. So most years we do have a budget deficit. And then every year's budget deficit then adds up to what we call our national debt. And you should pull up the national debt calculator. I can't remember if I did that for you guys when we were still in the classroom or not, but it's like nationaldebtclock.com or something like that. And it will actually sort of show you what the running national debt is and really how it's divided into different subcategories. It's a fascinating thing to look at. So there is a rationale for budget deficits. There is a reason why the government and the American people, for that matter, feel like running a budget deficit from year to year to year isn't a problem. And it's because when the government spends money, it creates that multiplication effect. It stimulates the economy. It stimulates demand, which increases productivity, which reduces unemployment, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of good rationale. And you and I as Americans, I don't think we would appreciate higher taxes in order to decrease those deficits. I mean, we don't want it. We don't vote for people that say, you know what, our national debt's too high and we need to start correcting this problem. So we're going to need to raise everybody's taxes. We don't vote for that person. We vote for the person who tells us how much money they're going to spend on us, not how much they're going to try and get the national debt in check. So it's highly political, but you know that those are the people we vote for, right? So there are some philosophies about the deficits and the way that budgets are done, and those have changed over the years. Prior to the Great Depression, the federal government had a balanced budget. It only spent what it brought in. So it would tax people and then it would spend whatever it brought in, and it wouldn't spend more. It would operate really like any other business. Sorry, lost my train of thought. Okay. So prior to the Great Depression, balanced budget. Cyclically balanced budgets are sort of what I think our government was aiming for when they decided that they could spend money that they didn't have in order to stimulate the economy. Cyclically balanced budgets make sense, but it just sort of got out of control. So cyclical speaks to business cycles, so the ups and downs of the business cycle. So a cyclically balanced budget would be one in which we did have budget deficits during times of recession because the government was trying to stimulate the economy, because the government was trying to get that multiplication effect going. So the government would take on debt during times of recession in order to help the economy and help that multiplication. But then on the flip side of that, during good times, when we had low unemployment and we were experiencing an expansion in the business cycle, we should have the opposite thing happen. We should actually be stockpiling money because the government theoretically wouldn't need to spend as much because the people would be spending the money from the jobs that they had because the unemployment was so low. So the recessions and the expansions would sort of offset each other. And in total, you know, over the long run, we would actually stay pretty balanced in terms of budgets. We would have extra sometimes, which then we could spend during a recession and then stockpile again during expansions, so on and so forth. Well, what's happened is politics, right? Even when we're in expansions, politicians want to take credit for good economies and the momentum that they have for reelection or things like that. And they get a little overexcited about really heating up the economy, which makes them look good. And they're not putting money aside for recessionary times, because if the recession isn't during their term, what do they care? So this was the theory of using fiscal policy to sort of help in these depressions or these recessions, but hasn't really worked out the way that we thought. Federal deficits since the birth of the nation. So sort of the history of our deficits and of the totality of those deficits, which is the national debt, okay? So since the Depression, we're talking late 20s, early 30s, so since that time to present, there has been a deficit. So we're talking about just that annual budget deficit, 85% of total years. So you can see that we really do function as a normal part of, you know, government budgets in a deficit. I mean, it's typical. Some of our biggest deficits up to the 80s, so we're talking about from the 30s to the 80s, are really going to be war-related deficits. So a lot of times the government did borrow money to fight wars. Wars are good for economies. It does create momentum in spending and jobs and things like that in an economy. So I think every economist would say that wars actually end up being pretty good for economies, just because you're putting people to work, you're producing a lot of things that are required to support a war and putting a lot of people to work. But what we have seen is that a lot of times we don't have the extra money to fight a war, we have to borrow it. We actually did have a surplus of money. We actually did not have a national debt. We actually had a national surplus. 1998 to 2001. And this was the tail end of, I believe, the Clinton administration, that for a number of different reasons, I don't think we can ever give credit to just the president who's in office for taking care of these things. That's not the way the economy works. The economy builds over decades. But since 2001, we have really, really, really began to see the deficits and the national debt really crank up. Matt, you asked a question. Can you elaborate on that? Matt, you said it's a surplus question mark? Just during those years, we saw surplus. Okay. So why do deficits, okay. So why do deficits persist? Well, we sort of talked about that. I alluded to why deficits persist. And it is because the federal government, isn't required to balance the budget. It's not popular to balance budgets. It's not popular with voters to balance budgets. How you get votes? is you spend money on people, you don't increase their taxes, you give them much more than they pay for. Hence the national debt that we have. If you're trying to get reelected, you talk about how you're going to spend, not how you're going to tax. Okay? It's a problem. It's a problem in our system. Okay. Sorry, something happened here. Okay. So the federal deficit relative to GDP. So as a percent of GDP, don't get too wrapped up in the way this is set up. This is just sort of showing you over the past, 80, 100 years, something like that, sort of what we've seen in terms of deficits and sort of positive percentages. So you can see those big dips that take place, during the 1940s. Obviously, that's going to be the World War. And so we took on a lot of debt during that time. We have some Gulf War stuff in there for some short periods of time. We have a little bit of Vietnam in there. But you can see that World War II was really the biggest deficits and the biggest debts that we took on sort of in recent history. Okay, so this is probably the only part of this lecture that gets a little complicated, but I'm going to try and talk you through it. It is a concept we call crowding in or crowded out. The basic premise of these concepts is that when the government borrows money, it leaves less money for everybody else to borrow. Well, that makes sense, right? If the government needs money for day-to-day operations, it just simply leaves less money in the market for everybody else. On the flip side of that, if the government isn't borrowing money, it frees up money for everybody else. And when I say everybody else, I mean households and companies and firms. So those are these two concepts that we're going to talk about, crowding out and crowding in. But that's the basic premise. And I think if you understood what I just said, this is going to make, I think, make fine sense. So crowding out, this is the government crowding out the rest of the economy. So that's where the term crowding out comes from. So basically, when the government is increasing the national deficit and ultimately debt or national cumulative debt, it just reduces the amount of money in savings accounts that is available to lend out to private industry and to individuals. When there's less of anything in a market, the price goes up. The price of money is always interest rates. So when there's not a lot of money available to be loaned out, what we see in many cases are increased interest rates, unless the Fed steps in and things like that. But we'll cover that after your exam on Thursday. We'll cover that next week. We'll talk about the Federal Reserve Bank. And then discourages private investment, because when interest rates are high, it becomes hard to justify, huge debt or borrowing huge amounts of money. On the flip side of that crowding in is the government crowding us into the investment market or the spending market. So when the government decreases the deficit, so isn't borrowing as much money, it just simply leaves money in banks for the rest of us. When there is a lot of money available, it lowers interest rates. Again, when there's a surplus of anything, it's going to drive down the cost. In this case, we're talking about interest rate. And that's going to encourage private investment by individuals, companies, whatever. There's something we call the twin deficits. And this, sorry.
Hello.
Hey. Hello. Okay. Sorry. I have no idea what's going on here. So we talk about the twin deficits. The twin deficits is a combination of like a budget deficit for the government, and deficits in terms of trade. So we haven't talked about international trade yet in this class. I think it's the last chapter that we cover, but we do have a trade deficit in this country. Trade deficit means we import more than we export. And so these twin deficits, to finance deficits, the Treasury sells debt, pushing up interest rates. We'll get into the specifics of that after you take your exam and once we start talking about monetary policy. So you don't need to worry much about that. What that is saying is that the government is borrowing money. And when they borrow money, it pushes up the interest rates. The dollar appreciates, causing US goods to become more expensive, which causes a trade deficit. The reason US goods aren't really demanded in a lot of other parts in the world is because they're just too expensive for those people to buy, right? So that's one reason why we don't export a lot and why people in other countries don't buy a lot. Is it's just not feasible for them. But it is the reason we import a lot. So this increases a trade deficit that we already have. I don't think myself or any other economist feels like our trade deficit's too big. It is what it is due to comparative advantage, and you can't argue with comparative advantage too much. So in our current situation, so I got a question from Sean. So in our current situation, which one of these is going on? Well, we have an interesting thing going on, and that's that the Federal Reserve Bank stepped in to deal with interest rates. So we haven't talked about monetary policy yet. It just adds another piece of confusion, another layer onto all of this. But I would say, without talking about what the Fed is doing, you know, we would be crowded out because the US government's going to try and find $2.2 trillion now, and they got to borrow it from somebody. And when they borrow it from somebody, it means we don't get it. The Fed has stepped in because they knew that was going to be a problem. Okay, I hope that helps. Sean, you might just have to hang in there until we talk about monetary policy, because then we'll just talk about how the Fed can just swoop in and you know, fix this situation. All right. Oops. Okay, so I know these are some old numbers here, but I always try and just put in what your book has, because I try and sort of put in your author's information, and then I can talk about how it's different. Measuring the national debt, again, you've got to look at this website. It will really trip you out. The national debt stock variable measuring the net accumulation of past deficits. So a stock variable is something that you can measure at one singular point in time. So basically, at any point in time, I could log on to that website, or I'm sure there's a more credible website out there that tracks the national debt. And I could tell you, the national debt at this point in time is whatever. And at the time when the book was published, the national debt, 17.8 trillion. Again, like I told you, we're in the low 20s right now. I believe it's 22, something like that. But we're talking about adding on that additional 2.2, raising the national debt by 10%, which is that's not a detail. That's huge. That should be concerning to all of us, because at some point we got to pay it back, right? Interest on the national debt. So again, I did it at the same time that your book was published, if you will. You can see proportionately what the interest on the national debt per year would look like if the national debt were at 17.8. So obviously now at 22, it's going to be much higher than that. So we're talking about $500 billion a year just in interest on the national debt. So I don't know how we're going to figure that out. But so the national debt. So a lot of people ask me, how long Can these trillions of dollars of national debt and these yearly annual deficits, how long can this actually go on? Well, it can go on forever, as long as there are people out there willing to loan us money. It could literally go on forever. We get about 50, I think I mentioned this in the last lecture. Oh, thank you. It looks like somebody posted our new national debt amount for me, and it's $23+ trillion, so $23.6 trillion. Thank you for that. Yes, Mike Weebrook. Okay, so about 50% of the money the U.S. government gets is gonna just come in terms of investment through individuals who are investing in things like 401ks or with finance professionals can buy U.S. debt. Essentially, they can loan money to the U.S. government. Companies do it too. If they're looking for a pretty safe short-term investment, U.S. bonds are a pretty safe investment, or have been up till this point. A reason why other countries, and investors invest in U.S. debt is up to this point. The U.S. government has always been able to pay back its debt, except it borrows new money to pay off old money. So we just go find new money to pay off the debt that's coming due, those bonds that are coming due that need to be paid. So don't get it twisted, don't be confused. We're not paying off any debt. We're just borrowing new debt to pay off old debt, and we just keep doing that same thing, so on and so forth. But as long as people will continue. Oh, Maddie, thank you. I cannot cure Corona. Wish I could. I wish I could cure the economy from Corona. That's what I wish I could do. So who bears the burden of the debt? We ask ourselves this a lot. Don't you think if the government is spending money on us, that at some point we have to change our lifestyle and we have to pay some of it back? It would mean a huge lifestyle change for all of us, to not demand that the government give us so much. So it just is going to take the mindset change of generations of people in order to see if we can make this happen. Transfer payments are big, and especially Social Security. To me, Social Security is the biggest burden on future generations and on the federal budget. Social Security was never intended to support people for 30+ years of life. At the time Social Security was developed, I think that life expectancy was in the late 60s. So if you get Social Security when you're 62 and you're dead by the time you're 68, well, that's not a huge burden on the US government. Now you're just living a long time, but everybody still wants to retire in their 60s. It's just not realistic. Hang on, I think I have a question over here. If the government continuously borrows money and remains in debt, how would the US be in a surplus, or is it no longer possible? I mean, I don't know how you get rid of 23, soon to be $25 trillion worth of debt. That's essentially an entire year's worth of production in this country. I just don't know. I just don't know how we do that. I think we do it a piece at a time, but it's going to take a president that says that their popularity or their political agenda isn't as important as getting us out of debt. And you'd be hard pressed to find somebody like that. Because you and I aren't really interested in that at this point in time. I think very few Americans understand what our national debt looks like. So there's a couple there's a couple of things that we have to talk about when we talk about the burden of the debt. So if the money is borrowed from Americans or American companies, it's domestic debt, the money actually all stays in the US. So we loan the money to the US government, and then the US government pays us back with interest, but that's really just keeping the money cycling in the US economy. So I don't know if domestic debt is as big of a deal as foreign debt. Foreign debt, these are the monies that we really borrow from foreign countries, and that's about 50% of the money that we borrow comes from foreign countries. I don't know how this is all going to change because of the current situation. But that's the debt that worries me the most, because when the US government, us, our system, it's our debt, pays back foreign governments with that interest, that's money that's taken out of the US economy. So to me, that's more worrisome than this domestic debt, because that money just all gets recycled. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. Again, I know a lot of this stuff is dated because this book, I don't know why they haven't come out with a new edition yet, because the book's a little dated, but it's still pretty good data. If I thought it was crazy, I wouldn't show it to you, but it's pretty good data. So what you can see here is foreign debt holders. So essentially foreign countries we owe money to. Obviously, these numbers have gotten bigger, a lot bigger. And so you can see, because we've acquired a lot of national debt within the past 8 years, which is when this when this particular pie chart was put together. So you can see who our biggest international lender is, and that's going to be China. I mean, that's creating some problems. I don't know how much extra money China has right now to loan us. I don't know where Trump's going to get the $2.2 million or trillion dollars. I don't know. We'll just have to see. Japan, also a big lender. And then you can see there's some other interesting ones. The all others, it's hard to say what that is, but you can see oil exporting nations are big contributors. The reason that foreign countries invest in the US government is because they always get paid back. It's a good investment. It's a secure investment. Our economy has been pretty secure, all things considered, and we're pretty sure bet. It's why trade wars with China worry me a little bit. I mean, China's a huge lender, right? And has just become a bigger portion of the foreign lending since 2012. So I don't know. Food for thought, right? But we'll talk about trade wars in the last chapter of this semester. Okay, so this has gone pretty quick. Let me do this last slide, and then I have just a couple quick things to say. So crowding out and capital formation. So this is just going to give you a scenario about perhaps what should happen when the US government borrows money. Perhaps what would be the most economically sound decisions to make with money when you are, as the US government, if you are really crowding out the rest of the population from borrowing money themselves, or companies, firms borrowing money themselves. So if deficits are used to improve infrastructure, so we're talking about roads, we're talking about shipping ports, we're talking about airports, we're talking about any sort of line of distribution, that's really infrastructure that helps production. So if deficits are used to improve infrastructure, so if the government uses money to increase or improve infrastructure, that really increases our capital when it comes to overall productivity in this country. If we can do big things, that will help us down the line to increase productivity, perhaps those dollars are very well spent. Now, if deficits are used towards income redistribution, so here we're talking about transfer payments, we're talking about taxing people and then taking those dollars and redistributing them in form of Social Security, disability, unemployment, welfare, any of those reasons, that doesn't increase productivity always. It depends on how people spend that money, how it ripples through the economy, but it doesn't necessarily increase productivity and could actually cause the opposite because it provides an incentive maybe for people not to produce. Again, it depends on very particular circumstances, what we would tend to see here, but spending money on improving infrastructure can be very, very valuable down the line in terms of overall productivity in an economy. So this is just having you think about how money is spent when it's borrowed by the government and it crowds the rest of us out. Maybe how we could look at how that money is spent to see how it would be more effective. I know we're in very particular times right now, and it's hard to say what would be the right or wrong thing to do with federal deficit money, but anyway, food for thought. Okay, so that's actually the end of the lecture. Couple of things.